Nike just dropped Aryna Sabalenka, and Alex Eala's jersey is the exact reason why. A 19-year-old from Manila outsold the world's #1 player globally, and the most powerful sportswear corporation on the planet responded without hesitation. This wasn't gossip circulating in tennis locker rooms. This wasn't speculation dressed up as journalism. This was a seismic, documented corporate earthquake, and the aftershocks are still being felt across every corner of professional women's tennis. A two-time Grand Slam champion, dismantled not by a better backhand or a sharper serve, but by a spreadsheet, by a sales report, by the cold, unforgiving mathematics of global consumer demand. And the player who triggered it all? A teenager who grew up dreaming of courts she could barely afford to access, representing a nation that had never produced anything like her before. By the time the story finishes, you will never look at sports sponsorship or Alex Eala the same way again. To understand how dramatically things collapsed, you first need to understand how magnificently they had been constructed. Aryna Sabalenka did not arrive at the top of women's tennis quietly. She announced herself like a thunderclap, powerful, unmistakable, impossible to ignore. The Belarusian powerhouse built her game around aggression, around dominance, around the kind of relentless baseline destruction that made opponents feel like they were facing something elemental rather than human. Her serve alone was a weapon that most players on tour would trade their entire arsenal to possess. By 2023, she had claimed her first Australian Open title. By 2024, she had defended it, becoming only a handful of players in the modern era to successfully retain that crown. She climbed to world #1 with the inevitability of someone who had always believed that position belonged to her, and she was right. But Sabalenka's empire was never built solely on court results. The truly remarkable construction happened off the court, in boardrooms and marketing meetings and brand strategy sessions, where executives looked at her numbers and saw something that made their eyes widen. She was bankable. Ferociously, reliably, extraordinarily bankable. Her partnership with Nike represented one of the most significant sponsorship arrangements in women's tennis at that time. Nike didn't just put her name on apparel, they built campaigns around her identity, her power, her unapologetic intensity. She became the visual embodiment of a particular kind of athletic excellence that Nike had spent decades trying to capture and bottle. Raw, dominant, unafraid. The merchandise performed accordingly. Sabalenka's Nike line moved units across European markets with particular strength. Germany, Poland, Czech Republic, the broader tennis-passionate continent that had always consumed women's tennis merchandise hungrily. Her social media presence amplified everything. Millions of followers, high engagement rates, a personality that translated across languages, because power needs no translation. She was, by every conventional metric available to a sports marketing department, the perfect face for the world's most recognizable athletic brand. Coaches referenced her. Young players studied her. Little girls in tennis academies across Eastern Europe pinned her image to their walls. Sabalenka had achieved something that transcends rankings and trophies. She had achieved cultural penetration. She had become a symbol of what women's tennis looked like at its most ferocious and beautiful. Nike knew exactly what they had, and they invested accordingly. The apparel deals, the campaign budgets, the premium shelf placement in retail environments globally, all of it pointed toward a long, mutually lucrative relationship between a corporation built on athletic aspiration and an athlete who personified it completely. Nobody in that partnership was thinking about exit strategies. Nobody was modeling contingency scenarios. Nobody was preparing for the possibility that a teenager from the Philippines, a country without a single WTA title to its name before her, would walk into their carefully constructed commercial universe and detonate it from the inside. But that is precisely what happened. And the first sign that something extraordinary was shifting came not from a tennis court, not from a press conference, not from any of the places where tennis stories traditionally begin. It came from a warehouse, from shipping manifests, from online checkout data that started climbing in directions nobody had projected. It came from Alex Eala's jersey numbers. And when those numbers landed on the right desks at the right corporation, nothing in women's tennis would ever be positioned the same way again. Because here is what nobody tells you about sporting empires. They don't fall from the outside. They collapse from beneath, quietly, numerically, inevitably, when something newer and hungrier and more resonant with the moment arrives and takes the ground right out from under them. Sabalenka's empire was magnificent, but magnificence has never once made anything permanent. Projections exist for a reason. Market analysts build models, brand strategists run demographic surveys, sports marketing departments spend considerable resources attempting to predict which athletes will translate into commercial gold before the rest of the world catches up. They study social media growth curves, regional interest patterns, and junior to professional conversion rates. They build spreadsheets designed to eliminate surprise. Alex Eala destroyed every single projection they had. What happened with her merchandise was not a gradual climb that anyone could have spotted early and prepared for. It was vertical, sudden, the kind of growth curve that makes experienced data analysts lean back in their chairs and stare at their screens, wondering if something has corrupted the numbers. Nothing corrupted the numbers. The numbers were horrifically, beautifully accurate. It began with the Philippines. Obviously, when your country has waited its entire sporting history for someone like you, the response when you finally arrive is not measured or restrained, it is total. Filipino fans didn't just purchase Eala's jersey, they mobilized around it like it represented something sacred, because for them, it did. Every jersey sold was a declaration. Every purchase was a vote, a statement that said, we exist, we compete, we belong at this table alongside everyone else. The Filipino fan base for Eala operated with an organizational intensity that caught even experienced tennis marketers completely off guard. Fan clubs coordinated bulk purchasing campaigns, social media communities shared links, promoted merchandise drops, celebrated sales milestones like collective victories. The cultural machinery of Filipino fandom, which anyone familiar with Southeast Asian sports culture would recognize as among the most passionate and coordinated anywhere on Earth, activated fully and completely around one 20-year-old tennis player. But here is what separated the Eala phenomenon from simply being a patriotic purchasing surge in one country. It spread. The jersey started moving in markets that had no obvious cultural connection to the Philippines whatsoever. Tennis communities in Japan, South Korea, Indonesia, and across the broader Asia-Pacific region began registering significant Eala merchandise numbers. Then Europe. Pockets of extraordinary demand appearing in cities and countries where Filipino diaspora communities had quietly been waiting for exactly this kind of moment, a player they could claim, celebrate, and wear on their chest. Then the casual fans arrived. The tennis-adjacent audience, people who follow sports culture without necessarily tracking every ranking point, discovered Eala's story and responded to it the way human beings have always responded to narratives of unlikely excellence, with enthusiasm, with wallets open. Her journey from Manila to Grand Slam courts was not just a sports story. It was the kind of story that transcends sport entirely, reaching people who had never once watched a WTA match but understood immediately and completely what she meant. Social media accelerated everything. Clips of her matches circulated beyond tennis accounts into general sports content ecosystems. Her composure under pressure, that particular quality she carries of seeming entirely unbothered by moments that would visibly rattle most players, made for extraordinarily compelling short-form content. She looked, on screen, like someone who had already decided how this story ended. The jersey followed the content. Everywhere her story traveled, merchandise demand materialized behind it. Nike's regional teams began flagging the numbers internally, first as an interesting anomaly, then as a genuine trend, then as something that required urgent conversation at levels well above regional management. Because when the quarterly comparison arrived, Eala's merchandise performance measured directly against Sabalenka's across the same international markets and time frame, the document that landed in front of Nike's senior leadership didn't just show a competitive performance, it showed a reversal. Complete, undeniable, mathematically unambiguous. A teenager from a nation without tennis infrastructure had outsold the world's #1 player. Globally, across markets that Nike had spent years carefully cultivating around Sabalenka's identity and image. The room where that data was first presented must have been very, very quiet. And in that silence, decisions began forming that Sabalenka, still competing, still winning, still believing her commercial position was as secure as her ranking, had absolutely no awareness of whatsoever. What would you do with that information? What does a corporation built on backing winners do when its definition of winner suddenly, completely changes? Corporate decisions of this magnitude don't happen in a single meeting. They accumulate. They build through layers of internal conversation, data review, strategic assessment, and the particular organizational calculus that large corporations apply when they sense that the ground beneath a major investment has fundamentally shifted. There are presentations, there are counter-arguments, there are advocates for continuity and voices for disruption, there are legal teams reviewing contract language and financial teams modeling termination costs against projected opportunity losses. And then, eventually, clarity emerges. Cold, commercial, absolute clarity. The internal data that Nike's analytics division compiled through the first half of 2025 told a story that no amount of brand loyalty or historical partnership sentiment could argue against. Ella's merchandise wasn't just performing strongly in isolation, it was actively cannibalizing Sabalenka's market share in key demographics. The 18 to 34 age group, the most commercially valuable audience in sports marketing, was migrating. Not completely, not overnight, but directionally, measurably, and with gathering momentum. The Asia-Pacific region, a market Nike had identified as a primary growth priority for the coming decade, showed the starkest numbers. Sabalenka had never penetrated that market with particular depth. Her appeal was strongest in Europe and among hardcore tennis audiences globally. Ella, by extraordinary contrast, was generating the kind of organic, culturally embedded demand in Asia-Pacific that marketing budgets measured in hundreds of millions of dollars typically fail to manufacture. She was doing it naturally, authentically, because she was from there, because her story was their story. And for Nike, whose entire brand philosophy rests on the mythology of authentic athletic aspiration, "Just do it" is not an advertising slogan, it is a worldview. The alignment between Ella's narrative and their deepest brand values was not lost on anyone in those internal meetings. Meanwhile, separate conversations were happening about Sabalenka's broader commercial trajectory. Her on-court dominance remained undisputed, but dominance in the modern sports marketing landscape is necessary but insufficient. The metrics that increasingly drive sponsorship decisions extend far beyond winning percentages and ranking positions. Engagement rates, sentiment analysis, cultural resonance, cross-demographic appeal, narrative momentum. Sabalenka scored powerfully on some of these measures and less powerfully on others. Her personality, direct, fierce, occasionally combustible in press conferences, was simultaneously her greatest commercial asset and a complexity that brand teams navigated carefully. She was compelling. She was not universally embraceable in the way that certain athlete narratives become genuinely global properties. Ella, by this point, was approaching something close to universal embraceability. The underdog framing, the pioneer status, the visible composure masking an interior fire that fans across cultures recognized and responded to. Her story had the architecture of something timeless. Nike strategists are paid extraordinary sums to recognize timeless when it appears. The decision, when it finally crystallized, was not made carelessly or impulsively. It was made with the thoroughness and precision that a corporation of Nike's scale applies to every significant strategic pivot. Contracts were reviewed, obligations were mapped, exit provisions were examined and legally validated, and then the conversation that Sabalenka never saw coming was initiated. Not a renegotiation, not a repositioning, a termination. Swift, definitive, immediate in its execution, even if months of deliberation preceded it. The most powerful sportswear brand on earth had looked at two athletes, one at the peak of her competitive dominance and one at the beginning of her ascent, and made a choice that sent a message louder than any campaign they had ever produced. The future had a different face, and Nike intended to be wearing it. When news of Nike's decision reached the public, the initial response was disbelief. Not because people doubted the reports. The sourcing was solid, the confirmation came through established sports business channels, but because the scale of it demanded a moment of genuine processing. This was not a minor apparel brand making a minor roster adjustment. This was Nike, the definitive athletic corporation, dropping the world's #1 women's tennis player immediately because a teenager's jersey outsold hers. The sports media apparatus absorbed the story and then detonated it across every available platform simultaneously. Business journalists covered the commercial angle, the strategic logic, the market data, the precedent it set for athlete sponsorship decisions in an increasingly globalized sports economy. Tennis journalists covered the human angle, what this meant for Sabalenka, how she received the news, what her camp was saying publicly, and what they were saying privately. Cultural commentators covered the broader angle, what a corporation's choice to elevate a Filipina athlete over a European champion revealed about shifting global power dynamics in sport and commerce. Sabalenka herself addressed it, briefly, carefully, with the controlled composure of someone who had received very specific advice about exactly how much to reveal. She described the situation as disappointing, acknowledged the commercial realities of professional sport, and refused to direct any visible anger toward Nike, toward Eala, or toward the circumstances that had produced this outcome. It was a masterclass in dignified restraint from someone who was, by any honest assessment, entitled to feel devastated. Because losing a Nike partnership at the height of your competitive career is not simply a financial blow, significant as that dimension is, it is an identity disruption. Sabalenka had built her brand image in close collaboration with Nike's aesthetic language. The visual story of her athletic identity, the way she presented herself to the world commercially, was woven through with that partnership. Its sudden absence created a gap that went beyond dollars and contracts. Tennis Twitter, as it reliably does during moments of significant drama, divided into factions with extraordinary speed. One side expressed genuine sympathy for Sabalenka, arguing that punishing a dominant champion for being outsold by a viral cultural phenomenon was a corporate betrayal of the relationship that athletic sponsorship is supposed to represent. These voices pointed out that Sabalenka had delivered everything Nike could have asked for competitively. She won, she performed, she represented the brand on the sport's grandest stages. The opposing perspective was more ruthless in its commercial pragmatism. Nike is not a charity. It is not a loyalty program. It is a business that exists to generate returns. And when the data shifts, the business responds to the data. Sentiment doesn't ship jerseys. Sales figures do. Both arguments carried genuine weight. Both revealed something true about how professional sport and commercial partnership actually function beneath the inspiring surface narrative. And through it all, the debate, the analysis, the hot takes, and the measured assessments, Alex Eala remained almost entirely silent. She posted no celebration, she made no statement, she let her jersey numbers speak for themselves, which they did, loudly and in every language simultaneously. That silence was, characteristically, more eloquent than anything she might have said. Pull back from the drama for a moment. Pull back from the jersey numbers and the corporate maneuvering and the social media warfare. Look at what actually happened here. At its structural, historical core, a young woman from the Philippines, from a nation that global sports commerce had never once considered a primary market, a demographic, a target audience worth building major campaigns around, generated enough authentic consumer demand to fundamentally alter the sponsorship strategy of the world's most powerful athletic brand. She didn't do it through manufactured controversy. She didn't do it through carefully engineered viral moments or strategic brand consultants. She did it by being exactly who she is, competing at the highest level she could reach and representing something that resonated with people the marketing industry had been systematically underestimating for decades. The Asian sports consumer, the global South fan base, the diaspora communities scattered across every major city on Earth, waiting quietly for someone to root for who looked like their own reflection. Nike's pivot toward Eala, whatever specific contractual arrangements ultimately formalized that relationship, represented something larger than a sponsorship decision. It represented an acknowledgement from the most influential brand in athletic history that the geography of sporting stardom has permanently, irreversibly shifted. This matters beyond tennis, beyond Eala, beyond Sabalenka. It matters because it establishes a precedent. The next young athlete from Indonesia, from Vietnam, from Nigeria, from any nation historically invisible to the commercial machinery of global sport, now has evidence, documented, reported, commercially validated evidence that their story can generate the kind of demand that moves corporations. That is not a small thing. That is genuinely revolutionary. For Sabalenka, the aftermath of this moment will ultimately depend on what she chooses to do with it. She remains one of the finest tennis players currently competing anywhere on Earth. Her ranking doesn't change because a brand changed direction. Her serve doesn't weaken because a spreadsheet told a story she didn't write. Other major brands will evaluate her, and several moved quickly to express interest in the immediate aftermath of Nike's decision because Sabalenka's competitive value proposition remains formidable. But the psychological landscape shifted. The narrative around her changed. And in the world of modern athletic celebrity, where narrative is commercial value, that shift carries weight. For Eala, this moment arrives at the precise inflection point of a career that is still in its earliest chapters. The commercial validation, extraordinary as it is, means nothing if it becomes a distraction from the competitive development that must remain her primary focus. The greatest risk facing her right now is not institutional obstruction or corporate politics. It is the seductive noise of premature celebrity pulling her attention from the court where her actual destiny will be determined. Those closest to her suggest she understands this completely, that she wears the commercial success with the same lightness she brings to every other external pressure, acknowledging it, not dismissing it, and then setting it aside to do the work. That, perhaps more than any jersey number or sponsorship announcement, is what makes her genuinely exceptional. Because talent without mental clarity is fragile, but talent anchored in unshakable self-knowledge, the kind that doesn't mistake external validation for internal worth, that is something built to last. The sports industry just learned that Alex Eala's commercial power is extraordinary. What it hasn't yet fully reckoned with is that her psychological foundation may be even more formidable than her forehand. And that combination, commercial magnetism plus mental bedrock, is precisely what creates legacies that outlast every trend, every corporate pivot, and every dramatic chapter in between. So here is the question this entire story demands you sit with. Has the sporting world finally reached the moment where a player's cultural resonance permanently outweighs their competitive ranking in determining who the industry crowns as its face? And if so, what does that mean for every athlete who comes after Alex Eala, carrying their own country's hopes onto courts that were never originally built with them in mind? Aryna Sabalenka built an empire that any athlete would be proud to claim. She earned every endorsement, Every campaign, every moment of commercial recognition through relentless competitive excellence. Her story deserves respect, full, unqualified respect. But sport has always moved forward. It has always found the next voice, the next face, the next story that captures something the previous moment couldn't quite reach. Alex Eala didn't take anything from Sabalenka. She simply arrived, fully, authentically, completely, and the world responded to what it saw. Nike followed the world, as it always has, as it always will. The real victory here belongs to every young athlete from every overlooked nation who watched this unfold and understood, perhaps for the first time, that the commercial machinery of global sport is not fixed. It bends, it shifts, it follows demand. And demand follows truth. Drop your thoughts below. Do you think Nike made the right call, or did they abandon a champion for a trend? The comment section belongs to you. Subscribe right now if you want the stories that go deeper than the headlines, the ones that reveal what women's tennis is truly made of beneath the surface, because we are nowhere near finished.